Thank you, Hugo, and thank you, certainly Institute Giacometti, and as well as Delhi Art Gallery. It's a great pleasure to meet Cousin Cordia this afternoon. Excuse me, sometimes my voice breaks. Apologies beforehand. Excuse me. Okay, so let's start. I want to begin with a little story. In 2006, the big sensation was at that time the sale of the Indian painter Taib Mehta's painting for a record $1.5 million at Christie's in New York. This was the very first for an Indian artist. So let's ask ourselves, is it true that today Indian artists are enjoying the same prestige as leading Western artists? I suggest that only those Indian artists who are considered by European critics or curators as subsidiary, and no insult meant to the artists anyway, subsidiary to Western modernism have won recognition. In global modernist and contemporary art, there is serious imbalance, I suggest, between the center and the periphery that causes non-Western artists to disappear under the radar. In short, the rise of modern art in India hasn't been unproblematic. And I think we cannot study non-Western modernism without looking at the complex discourse of colonial power and authority. The tendency to consider all non-Western modernist art as mere adjuncts of the dominant Western modernism. So what I'm going to do tonight, and this is based on my book, I want to take up three artists, very important ones: Amrita Sher-Gil, Rabindranath Tagore, and Jamini Roy. They displayed striking originality, I think, and radical imagination. And yet, they're hardly known to the West. Now, this isn't because of their intrinsic quality as such, but I would say because they occupy a marginal space within the history of global modernism. Let me go to the first image. Just before I start, I mean, a lot of these artists are hardly known to the West. So I wanted to just give you a quick reminder. Raja Ravi Verma was much earlier, an academic painter, the most famous in India. Then you had Rabindranath Tagore, creator and leader of nationalist art movement. His brother Rabindranath used the syntax of modernism, the first one. Syntax of cubism, the very first one. Amrita Sher-Gil, very first woman artist, professional. Rabindranath Tagore, the great poet, but also painter. And finally, Jamini Roy, very interesting. To me, the greatest painter of that period. And then I mentioned popular painting, drawing with origins in Calcutta, and the village scroll painting. I'll be talking about these, quite a few times, so just to know. Okay. Now, these Indian artists' engagement with modernism sprang from an inner compulsion rather than a desire to imitate the Western avant-garde. And yet, and I want to invoke the English art historian William George Archer, author of the very first history of modern art in India, who spent his entire time tracing the influence of specific European masters, of course Picasso, on the Indian artists he was studying. I want to put to you, and this is, we all art historians are guilty, tracing stylistic influence has been an obsession with us art historians, to the neglect of other more significant aspects of a work of art. Let me put it another way. By tracing Picasso's alleged influence on particular Indian artists, how much do we get to appreciate their achievements and aims? After all, the cultural background, the context of the Indian avant-garde was so far removed from that of Western artists. So that's why I think influence as an explanatory tool doesn't really take us very far. In other words, when we speak of modernism as such, we may ask ourselves, modernism for whom? Just to go back, this is one of Rabindranath Tagore's painting, and he uses the syntax of modernism, of cubism, which I'll talk about in a minute. But let's get to a very well-known figure. I didn't tell you who it is, I hope. Now, I want to move away from this obsession with influence and present this Indian artist to you as they are. It's then, I hope, the specific cultural meanings and achievements of these modern paintings will become clearer to us. Now, one of the driving forces in the formative period of Indian avant-garde, that's really from 1920s to 1940s, has been the concept of primitivism. I want to take this up because it has lots of different connotations. I wanted to use Gauguin as a good example of what is seen in popular imagination as primitivism. His romance, who left his job and his wife, family, comfortable home in Paris for a tortured but romantic existence in distant Tahiti. His paintings stress the unashamed innocence of Tahitian women. This is a myth, perhaps, but it's a very powerful myth. He's a wonderful painter. Anyway, primitivism actually has been a global phenomenon. The romantic longing of modern societies for the simplicity of pre-modern existence. So it's not only Gauguin, but Cubists, Expressionists, Surrealists, all of them owe a deep debt to primitivism. You have seen this painting of Picasso, his portrait, which resembles African mask. Now, modern artists in the early 20th century were enthralled with Freud's theory of unconscious and the French anthropologist Lévi-Breuil's theory of pre-modern mentality. The avant-garde declared their allegiance to primitive art, to children's art, to art of the mentally ill. The naivety of primitive art is a myth. Because African art is governed by strict rules. You have an example here. But we all know that the idea that primitive art is without rules helped liberate Western artists from the rules of the classical canon. And of course, who better than to Raphael to represent classical perfection? Now, Indian artists entered the world of the global avant-garde through primitivism. And that's a very important point. Colonial empires had introduced print technology to non-Western countries. This had helped create a global culture by bringing the center and periphery closer. Now, let's think. During the British Empire, few Indian middle classes could afford to travel abroad. But print technology, as well as the English language, gave them access to global knowledge. Of course, this was similar to Spain and its colonies, the use of Spanish language. It enabled them to be what I call virtual cosmopolitans. And one of the concepts Indian artists engaged with, and I think made an important contribution to, was global primitivism. We know primitivism had a bad press recently. The famous exhibition in New York, Primitivism in 20th Century Art, 1985, caused a furious controversy. It was seen as part of colonial oppression. Edward Said described Primitivism rather poetically as the age-old antitype of Europe, a fecund night out of which European rationality developed. It is true that colonial scholars have a point, and I agree with that. But there is that aspect of the primitive which Hal Foster talks about, emerged as dark, feminine, profligate, and remained what he called a disidentification with white, patriarchal, bourgeois society. So what I want to suggest to you is that primitive is not one word. It's full of ambiguities, contradictions. So it can be open to different interpretations. So I'm going to now be so bold as to propose another definition of primitivism, which I think will offer a variety of possibilities. In fact, primitivism gave the colonized a powerful weapon to criticize Western industrial society, of course, which was the cornerstone. Industrial capitalism was the cornerstone of colonial empires. So the Indians, in their resistance, discovered allies in the West itself, who were also critical of an unquestioned faith in modernity and progress. So against this background, I want to take up three Indian artists I mentioned. It's Tagore, Sher-Gil, and Jamini Roy, between 1922 and 1947, who in their very different ways provide us with very personal interpretation of primitivism. But I want to just to give you an idea about what was happening in India before that, which actually forms a background to Indian modernism. The British introduced academic art in India. Let me come to that. Okay. Art in India. Traditional art practices, patronage, artist, the master-apprentice relation were transformed by art schools, art exhibitions, and also process of mechanical reproduction. All this led to the triumphal progress of Victorian academic art in India. You see an example here, Raja Ravi Verma, I mentioned before. He was a celebrated history painter of the 19th century who imagined India's past in a thoroughly Victorian mode. I want to show you his popularity by using an example. This is based on his print, oleograph. Now, this is based on ancient epic, Mahabharata, and the nymph. This is the great sage, meant to be celibate, no sex at all. And suddenly something happened terrible. And this very beautiful celestial nymph produces a baby. So he is wondering about paternity suit. While he was doing that, the Mellon's baby food manufacturers put in that thing. Mellon's baby food is good for the baby. I like to sometimes be autobiographical. I was given Mellon's baby food as a child, so you can see how old I am, ancient I am. Okay. Very popular, very popular. So early nationalists were inspired by him, Verma. But the next generation dismissed him as a colonial hybrid. So the next generation of nationalist artists, they're the beginning of nationalism. I mean, Verma was also a nationalist, but in the Victorian mode. Rabindranath Tagore, he led the Bengal school. He constructed his own authentic, and this is the whole word, authenticity, authentic Indian art, by rediscovering indigenous artistic styles, especially Mughal painting. This is a very famous painting he did in 1903, the last moments of the Emperor Shah Jahan, the builder of Taj Mahal. But what he does here is he uses the pietre d'oeuvre details from Taj Mahal to create this sense of Indianness. And also it's flat, which he wanted to convey. But if you look at it, the picture is suffused with Victorian melancholy. It's very Victorian in its mood. So this is Rabindranath imagining, as you know, Mughal art. I want to show you actual Mughal painting. A great Akbarnama, the album from the Victorian Albert Museum, the great Emperor Akbar, resting after his hunting expedition. Very different in the use of color and so on. In fact, Rabindranath didn't find bright colors sympathetic. He felt that they didn't do justice to his kind of nationalist art. And then the next stage is very interesting. He creates Oriental art, calls it Oriental art, a synthesis of different Asian art forms. Mughal conventions, and now I bring something new. Japanese Morotai wash technique. Why? About 1900, intellectuals in Asia began to challenge Western materialism, and they saw the whole of Asia as one, which is a myth. It's not true. I mean, Japan, China, India, they're all very different. But it gave them a very powerful idea to ally themselves. And so the Japanese, famous curate, intellectual and art teacher, Okakura, and Indians created Pan-Asian art, leading to Rabindranath. I'm going to quickly go through it because, this is an example from Taikan, who is a pupil of Okakura. He came to India and he learned Mughal painting techniques, and he also influenced Rabindranath's own style, kind of wash painting, Morotai, leading to this Rabindranath's very important painting. It combines a political message instead of traditional Indian gods, deities whose arms hold different weapons. Here you see nationalist objects held by its mother India, Bharat Mata. Very important image that period, in 1905, the first nationalist movement. So she has, sheaf of corn, cotton fabric, a manuscript, and rosary. Why? Food, clothing, secular knowledge, spiritual knowledge. Okay, so he creates this. Now, I just want to give you that sense of what was going on. You now have a tremendous change coming in. So between 1880s and 1920s, historicism, archaeology of the past, was the prime inspiration for nationalism. So in the 1920s, a turning point came, and that coincided with the arrival of European modernism in India. So this series of developments gave rise to an alternative artistic mode. Now, you have seen already Rabindranath Tagore, I mentioned that. He uses the syntax of Cubism. I'm not going to talk too much about him tonight, just to say he was the first one to experiment. But ultimately what he produced was very unique, his own brand of poetic kind of lyricism. But very important, the background to primitivism. On the political level, nationalists now identified the nation with the locality, the village, and the peasant. Mahatma Gandhi's dramatic entry into Indian politics in 1918 brought the rural population within anti-colonial struggle. Until now, Indian nationalism was dominated by lawyers and intellectuals from big cities. But Gandhi once described the West as a slave to the machine. I call him the most famous primitivist of the 20th century. So under his influence, nationalists discovered primitive tribes, hunter-gatherers, who entered the nationalist discourse. These children of nature, it was said, had retained the humanity that had been lost with colonial rule. Now, the image of the primitive tribes, Santhal women, a particular tribe in Bengal, became very sexualized and linked with the myth of the healthy, natural vitality. And that provided the counterpoint to the supposed loss of vigor in the elite under colonial domination. So here you have Ketindranath Majumdar, very difficult name. His allegory is about Yamuna, who is the dark sister of Ganga, which is the Ganges in English, who is imagined as, as dark. He's always seen as dark, Yamuna, as opposed to Ganga, who is seen as a pale goddess. And finally, a young Devi Prasad Roy Choudhury, who was a very famous sculptor later on, his painting of Mother and Child was shown at the Empire exhibition at Wembley in 1924. Just to show you how these painters celebrate the innocent, nubile sexuality of Santhal women as a foil to the cloistered ladies of urban Calcutta. Something else was happening. In the 1920s, the Indian intelligentsia, mostly urban, of course, came to appreciate the so-called low art forms practiced by craftsmen, who are now rebranded as the authentic, real expression of Indian culture. The new nationalist agenda reflected avant-garde ideas as well. What was it? Aesthetic preference for simple forms as opposed to Victorian over-ornate taste. Excuse me, sorry. And the moral preference of the simplicity of village life to the decadence of colonial cities. So you have Calicut painting, Calcutta popular art, low art of Calcutta, and then also you have Partha or scroll painting, Port, which was documented by nationalist scholars between 1926 and 1934. This all kind of reviving these forgotten forms of art. Now, why? These humble art forms were considered essential for the renewal of the nation. Now, one other event was very important that hastened the reception of avant-garde art in India. You probably know about it, but it might come as a surprise that in 1922, an ambitious exhibition of the works of Paul Klee, Vasily Kandinsky, and the Bauhaus artists took place in Calcutta. Amazing. I mean, why? I've talked about it elsewhere. I mean, I've been working on this for the last 10 years with the Bauhaus Foundation. This was because of the behest of the great Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore. He had visited Germany in 1918, and he personally, I don't think, met these artists, but he was the great inspiration behind it. So that led to this very important exhibition in Calcutta. And it was the very first great event of transcultural modernism. Now, I want to now turn to the actual artists, the three personalities I want to talk about. This was stunning Amrita Sher-Gil, also the first professional woman artist of India. Let me tell you what the wife of the last governor of Bengal describes her. She says, an Indian with a measure of European blood, because she was half Hungarian. She returned to India to shed her acquired skin. She saw her country with new vision and has left a legacy of pictures, simple, grand, as a tribute to the Indian countryside and its people. She died very young, 28. Her brief life attained an iconic status because, as you can see, of her legendary beauty, her precocious talent, her turbulent life, and finally her tragic death. Now, she was the daughter of a Sikh nobleman. And a Hungarian opera singer. She spent her childhood part in Hungary, part in India. And at 16, he was sent to Paris to learn art at those various schools she went to. So, just to give you an example, her drawing done at this period, and then leading to, I think, a very important painting called The Conversation. But I find that her early works show influence of Paris, of course, but also of Hungarian primitivists, interestingly enough, of the Széchenyi commune. And when she comes back to India, I mean, she changes her style, and one of the first works in India was called Hill Men and Woman. It's sculpturesque, monochrome, very simple, with spare colors, and set against a neutral background. But what was turning point was her discovery, you might say, visit to the ancient Buddhist caves of Ajanta. These were 5th century paintings, very, very famous Buddhist painting. Now, for the nationalists, this was very important. And so she went there, and I suppose she says she was absolutely fell in love with it, with Ajanta. But also, Ajanta's, this kind of brownish, greenish, and austere colors enabled her to perfect her formalist style. So where you have this is where she comes to very, very sparse colors, reds, browns, greens of these frescoes, simple, impassive, virtually monochrome, and the plain background helping to highlight the few primary colors. It's a painting of young Brahmin acolytes, and it's one of her best-known works. That's her work, but I want to take up something else. Amrita Sher-Gil's and there are 3 forms of primitivism I'm going to talk about. Amrita Sher-Gil's primitivism was tied up with her own definition, self-definition as an Indian modernist, and her deliberate hostile relationship to Rabindranath Tagore, you've seen early, the Bengal school, and his Oriental art. She always attacked it. And her most devastating criticisms were reserved for the Bengal school. I think she needed to demolish its importance in order to establish her own cultural authenticity. She actually talks about in her memoirs. She said that when she first arrived in India and set foot on the Indian soil, her painting underwent a profound transformation in theme, in spirit, and in technique, becoming more fundamentally Indian. She then realized that her real artistic mission was to interpret the life of the poor Indians. That's interesting. To paint, and as she says, those silent images of infinite submission. And patience, to depict their angular brown bodies, strangely beautiful in their ugliness to reproduce on canvas the impression their eyes created on me, end quote. But of course she saw herself as a modernist, avant-garde. So to offset what she termed sentimental subject matter, naturally, the whole thing lends itself to sentiment and effeminacy. In that period, men and women are so worried about effeminacy. I mean, I hope we don't have the same views anymore. She created a technique consisting of abstract lines, colors, and design for interpreting rural poverty. She is celebrated as a painter of melancholy rural India. I mean, it doesn't matter if India's rural, India's melancholy or cheerful. Perhaps it's both. But what matters is how she imagined it. So with her abstract idiom, she creates what I call a sort of distancing effect. In her elegiac paintings of austere villagers who go about their daily business, undisturbed by the gaze of the outsider. The artist here is an outsider who is transfixed by the world that she knows only indirectly. She's not part of that society. And yet this emotional truth of our village India, I think, moves us deeply. There's a reason. It's a metaphor for her own alienated self. And that's very interesting. I just want to mention that a little. It's kind of mirror of her own image. Now, on the surface, her mixed Indo-Hungarian heritage didn't cause any undue insecurity, high social position. She moved with ease in high society, quickly winning a host of admirers and a dominant position in the art world. She rejected lovers. She took on, she was very prolific, you might say, in that. English journalist Malcolm Muggeridge knew her well, described her as, I would say intimately, I quote, a mixture of rosewater and methylated spirit. He actually was able to diagnose her problem as a victim of the tensions and displacements of the modern world, half European, half Indian. But there were other problems, issues. Bisexual, the voracious sexual appetite, and a totally amoral outlook on life. Her encounters with men left permanent scars. She found solace only in women, painting them with true empathy and understanding. In fact, this was student work done in Paris. One Parisian critic asked in astonishment, where did this young girl learn to see life with such pitiless eyes and without any illusions? In the late work, last one I showed of hers, called Two Girls Dated 1938, a nude white woman with piercing blue eyes stands in a provocative pose next to a demure black woman lightly touching her, who modestly covers parts of her naked body. I mean, I think we're tempted to read in this an allegory of the fragmented self, Hungarian and Indian, her national identity becoming entwined with her own divided self-image. Of course, Frida Kahlo comes to mind, but they didn't know each other of their existence. But here we must think of nationhood. And nationhood is not a fixed, authentic heritage. And that's why Sher-Gil's tragic vision of rural India becomes all the more compelling, because it lays bare the contradictions of modern existence. What's it like to be a woman, an artist, a cosmopolitan, and above all, an Indian? Interestingly, I've been looking at some of the women artists around the world. I've been very interested. And if you look at Russian women artists, Goncharova and a whole lot of them, They're very important artists, but they were always subservient to men. They never saw themselves equal to men. Sher-Gil did. She didn't care. She had the privilege, but she was, really the supreme thing. So that's interesting in that period where it's all male-dominated world. I now come to my second great artist, the great Indian poet, Rabindranath Tagore. He was a cosmopolitan and a fierce opponent of the narrow definition of Hindu nationalism. So he actually didn't use primitivism as an affirmation of nationhood. You see, primitive masks, I'll come to that in a minute, I'll show you. Primitive masks, totemic animals in his painting become a playful, ludic expression of his inner journey. He was the first non-European to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. And in fact, during the interwar years, he was probably the best-known world figure. I mean, he had hosts of admirers. André Gide, everybody, Einstein, and Charlie Chaplin, and the numerous ones. His poems inspired Leos Janáček, Alexander von Zemlinsky, and other European composers. Let me just start with early sketch, which he did as a young man, avid sketcher, very much part of their background. He learned to draw, and this is all right, nothing very remarkable. Suddenly, at age 60, he embarked on an art form which is both novel and provocative. Difficult to know why he did that, but there's some clues. He started making doodles, creating shapes out of crossed out text, scratching surfaces, joining lines. This is a fearsome reptile drawn on the page of, you see, what he did was he used his manuscript pages, writing poems, article, he scratched out, and out of which he began to create shapes. And this is in manuscript in 1923, dated 1923. But it is inspired to some extent by North American hide totems. 1930 is a very important year. His work's done always with pelican pen, washes. They were very well known in the West. Exhibition in Paris, the very first one, very first show in Paris. Organized by Georges Rivière, curator of the Trocadero Museum. I'll show you two. These were shown in Paris, there's two. And later in Berlin and other parts of Europe and America. Rivière had close links with modernism, and he accepted Tagore as a primitive artist, as a primitivist. It's interesting. That's why I think he placed Tagore's works next to an exhibition of oceanic art, thus suggesting their affinities. Well, Indian poets' lack of technical skill, of course, his childlike simplifications, his stream of consciousness treatment particularly appealed to the Western avant-garde, who appreciated, as you know, we know, primitive and child art. The French art critic was very friend of the surrealist Henri Bidoux. Drew comparison between Tagore's automatic painting and surrealism. A very long review, it's very interesting. Interestingly, in Germany, where Tagore was a legendary figure, you see this cartoon from the Simplicissimus. You see, when he arrived, every time he arrived in Germany, the society ladies started contemplating their navel in a yogic pose. So there's great kind of funny cartoons. There are a number of cartoons in Simplicissimus. But Tagore was a legendary figure. And also paintings were seen as a blow stuck for non-illusionist art. Very much in the spirit of expressionists like Munch and Nolde. There is some truth in this. But I have to insist that Tagore didn't seek inspiration from any specific expressionist painting. The primitivism of the expressionists, including that of the Bauhaus artists, struck a deeper chord in him. Of course, it was Freud who provided a new insight into automatic drawing and children's art, thus offering an unprecedented creative potential to artists. In this connection, there's a story. Tagore asked Freud to visit him at his hotel in Vienna on October 25th, 1926. But Tagore never disclosed what transpired between them. He never wrote about it. Freud, we know why, because Freud grumbled. He wasn't pleased to be summoned in that fashion. He said, what does Tagore think he is? Ask me to come and see him. But he did go, which is interesting. Now, Tagore's skills were limited, but his paintings reveal an artistic control, a strong sense of formal design, and an ability to discard unnecessary details. And yet, Tagore described his work as the unconscious courage of the unsophisticated, like someone who walks in a dream. Now, this isn't diffidence. He wished to stress that his art was a recapitulation of his childhood, going back to his childhood. He needed to regress to childhood in order to recover spontaneity. And of course, we know of parallels with Paul Klee, who also sought to learn from his own childhood drawings. But Tagore gave a further Freudian explanation of his artistic process as a series of accidental discoveries rather than premeditation. Because you see, this is where he lies as a child and dreams all these things, shadows cast on the wall, and he dreams all these figures. So Tagore emphasized two other elements, unpredictability and dream imagery. We know that ambiguity, unpredictable, indeterminacy, these were modern tropes. They invested Tagore's images with an enigmatic quality, the very stuff of modernism. Tagore's conversion to modernism had a deeper personal reason. This is what I'm coming to. Why? So I want to offer a tentative explanation. Tagore's worldwide reputation had rested on his romantic lyrical poetry with his mystical overtones, his formal, measured Olympian prose. Modernist ideas of alienation and displacement didn't form part of his mimetic vocabulary. But then he was growing old, failing health and sense of loss, and he began to question these very same mimetic canons that he had personally enriched in his youth. Also, like Marcel Proust in France, Tagore had become a national monument, but the younger generation quietly ignored his poetry. A letter dated 1928 already hints at his loss of poetic inspiration as lines began to cast a spell on him. So liberated from high canon of taste, Tagore produced some 2,000 paintings, evoking a very personal, erotic, enigmatic world inhabited by dark shadows, primitive masks, and totemic creatures. So, I now come to my last artist, final artist, who is Jamini Roy. Again, the governor of Bengal's wife, Lady Casey, was a great admirer of Jamini Roy. And she talks about him. Jamini Roy was most impressive in personality and looks. His head had some of the massive beauty of Picasso's, though his deep eyes were gentler and more withdrawn. In fact, Roy was very good-looking, handsome, very powerful face, head. Roy's long artistic life was fascinating. It spanned the whole entire era of Indian anti-colonial struggle, continuing into independent India. He displayed a restless desire to explore dazzling pastiches of styles, Eastern and Western. Here you see one, I see much more homage to Cézanne. He tried his hand at Chinese painting, a whole range. I loved doing that. But that wasn't all. He began with Oriental art. When I say Oriental art, this is Rabindranath's, the whole school. But it's not this virtuosity, and he had great skill at doing different things and different genres. But his compelling modernist vision of folk art that, to me, makes him a memorable artist of the late colonial era. And I declare my interest. He is, I feel, at that period, the greatest artist. Again, I come back to the wife of the governor. She correctly sensed Roy's influence on Amrita Sher-Gil, and he spoke about it. If not directly by his art, then by his philosophy, which drew strength from life and not from the past. So Jamini Rai created an alternative vision of modern Indian identity. And he used folk idiom, thereby seeking to restore the collective function of art. And that's very important. Collective function of art and rejecting artistic individualism. And what the German philosopher Walter Benjamin says, aura of a work of art. And these were colonial criteria for art. Individual, aura of work of art, and so on. Roy began as a graduate of art school in Calcutta in the 1920s. He was a very slow learner. He spent many years at the art school, but his teacher liked him and let him do what he wanted. He also at this time discovered Kalighat. It's his version. This was fashionable. All the elite were learning about Kalighat. But Roy here mimics the style, this artisan style, very well. And I think you can't often tell the difference. Now, next point is, why then did he reject Kalighat? He said that they had lost the rural ideal when they moved to Calcutta to serve an urban population. And that's very important. So what happens is he gives up Kalighat. In the mid-20s, he set off on his heroic journey to the Bengal countryside to recover surviving folk art. This I had photographed many years ago in his studio when I went to look at his work. Very fine Partha or scroll painting. So Roy gradually built up a sizable collection of village scroll painting and actually worked with humble village painters in order to learn from them. Now, why did I mention this? Roy reject Kalighat. He was a profound critic of colonial modernity, the hollow life of colonial cities, and his rejection of colonial rule was explained by him through a series of moral contrasts between the rural and urban values. And here you see an example, and I'm coming to. The vitality of the folk art of Bengal had preceded colonial intrusion, he said. The earlier insight of primitive artists, these artists, had declined in the colonial period, he agreed. But their strength still remained in the robust art of village painters, and this is actually terracotta sculpture, which he had collected from his home. He was came from a landed family. He had collected from Bankura. Now, what then happens? By extreme simplification and concentration on essentials, folk painting achieves the significance of a symbol, easily recognizable, timeless, and universal. Roy particularly admired the formal clarity and simplicity of Bengal folk painting, its crude outlines, executed in sweeping brushstrokes, and its elimination of details, which he described as the honesty of folk art. But this is Roy. At the same time, his academic training lent a certain firmness of drawing, an underlying structure to his work that's not usually found in folk art. So in search of his pre-colonial simplicity, Roy renounced oil paints. It's interesting. Turning to organic pigments, making his own canvas out of homespun fabric, khadi, is very interesting. Finally, to achieve the formal purity of folk art, he restricted his palette to 7 basic colors. The first stage, use of simply black, and then next stage he adds a few colors. And so, in 1931, Roy felt ready to present his epiphany to the Calcutta public, organizing the first major exhibition of his work actually in his modest home. But he wanted to give an idea of his own folk inspiration, and he transformed his home into Bengali living space, because by the time people used chairs and tables, one sat on the floor. So he lit clay lamps and then had the floor decorated with traditional Alpana patterns, placed cushions on the floor rather than sit on chairs. His own paintings were kind of complemented actual folk paintings. But why was it doing all this? A contemporary reviewer correctly diagnosed all this as a political act of rejecting pan-Indian national allegory. Earlier generations saw history and one India. That is the beginning of a much more regional idea, making the local signify the national. Now, Roy was very shy and quiet, but he began to enjoy a steady stream of Indian and foreign visitors, including Peggy Guggenheim, who acquired this particular piece of work. And in fact, in 1954, Steuben Glass in America commissioned this piece from him, and it was shown at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Now, Roy spoke not much, a little bit, taciturn, but visitors to Roy's studio, both Bengali and European, English, they began to faithfully record his reflection on art. And what's interesting is that they're all stray comments, but I hope I was right, to try and make sense, reconstruct it. And that's what I tried to do. So his first idea of indigenous village was deeply influenced by Rabindranath Tagore's, it was a seminal essay on the Indian village as the antithesis of the colonial city. But Roy also began to question the very foundations of the colonial ideology of art, its insistence on artistic individualism, as I mentioned, which was taken for granted by all artists since Ravi Varma. Ravi Varma was the one model himself on European academic artists. Secondly, Roy was deeply influenced by Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy's views on the social function of art. So he tried to make his workshop anonymous, deliberately subverting the notion of artistic originality. He started producing collaborative works, often refusing to sign his painting. Of course, collectors, they got really annoyed. They were scandalized because they feared Roy's works in their collection would lose their value, naturally. But it's important why he did that. Communal function of art came to hold a central place in Roy's artistic doctrine. He sought, he paid homage to different traditions because of his own ideology, and I'm coming to that. So, communal art. He asserted that the vitality of an artistic tradition depended on its mythological richness. So Roy actually talks about how in the West, the desperate search for an artistic ideal attended the decline of spiritual, crise de conscience. Certainly offered, this time, Christian mythology offered that special, cohesion society. So he actually implied that Western modernism was not only, it showed crisis of industrial capitalism, as I said, also crise de conscience. Losing its vital folk tradition, enriched by religious mythology, he said, this is his allegation, the modern West was forced to turn to primitive art for inspiration. Roy was particularly critical of Picasso for having to depend on African art. As he says, in the absence of a vital folk tradition in the West. This is not true, of course. And I'm not saying that Roy was correct in his criticism of Picasso. Nor did he know that Vasily Kandinsky drew upon the richness of Russian folk art. And in fact, unknown to him, in the 1930s, intense debates were going on in Germany on the communal function of art. The critic Wilhelm Hausenstein or the artist Oskar Schlemmer, for instance, explained the modernist movement in terms of restoring the collective function of art. These are kind of post-Marxian thinkers. Another theoretician of primitivism, Carl Einstein, was recently been revived. He believed that mythic structures mediated between the individual and the outside world. One reason for the alienation of modern man and woman was the decline in myth, ritual, and communal experience. Now, this is the now tricky question. How do we interpret these seeming affinities? And that's important. I don't want to suggest that inspirations of Roy and the German primitivists were similar. No. And in fact, Roy wasn't influenced by them, neither were they. Their historic experience was substantially different. But what is of significance is that Roy's challenge to colonialism as an expression of urban industrial capitalism had clear and what I call here is the structural affinities with Western critics of modernity. What happened? Western primitivists sought to restore the values of the pre-industrial community in the life of the modern alienated individual. Roy, on the other hand, used the notion of the village community as a weapon of resistance to colonial rule. So their responses to global modernity was part of what I call a transcultural dialogue in a virtual cosmopolis. In both cases, we find a clear recognition of the importance of myth in human society, which had declined with the rise of modern rationality. And I'm going to try and draw the talk to a conclusion. I've spoken too long. Roy's heroic search for an authentic Indian art and his utopian concept of the village as the site of the nation were of importance to the construction of Indian identity. But that didn't necessarily make him the most remarkable painter of pre-independence India, no. But it was his painting, his ability to create a seamless fabric of political and artistic ideas, that I find so compelling. His intense concentration and his ruthless ability to pare down inessential details to create an art of hieratic simplicity, to me certainly reminds me of Mondrian's intellectual journey in search of an idea. So Roy's output was limited in later stages, but within that small number of works, he created something of great radical sort of eye. Now, Roy was part of the generation of artists who saw village India with a fresh eye. So as they responded to global modernism, they also argued that any construction of cultural identity must come to grips with India's rural culture. So primitivism, which inaugurated modernism in India, has continued to fascinate Indians from 1920s onward. And actually it keeps re-emerging in the work of Indian artists even today. Thank you very much.